Hi, Kristen.
Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Doing well, doing well.
This is kind of weird for me. This is my first blogging heads not with... That's not true, actually. This is my first blogging heads not with a Democrat on the other side of the screen. But it's not my first blogging heads away from Bill. So I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah,
Who will I have? I feel like you and I will have more than enough differences over a few things.
Maybe. I was going to wear a beard for fun.
Because you are playing the role of Bill.
Right. I didn't shave today, but I don't think it's going to be enough.
Well, let's see. What topics, which one, do you want to talk about? To give the viewers a little bit of context, we're recording this very shortly after Mitt Romney has just given his healthcare remarks in Michigan. And so there are not as many instant blog reactions, but I have lots of tweets.
Yeah, lots of tweets.
Lots of tweets to talk about. So why don't we kick off with that? Matt, what are you seeing?
So I'm not seeing anything positive. Like, I know that during the last presidential race in 2008, Romney had a couple of diehard conservative bloggers like Hugh Hewitt and Catherine Lopez from National Review Online, who were just totally in the bag for him. Not seeing, on Twitter, not seeing a lot of that. Seeing a lot of negativity. Philip Klein actually tweeted and blogged over at The Examiner, Romney makes passionate case for violating personal freedom at state level. And I think that really sums it up. This is a tough sell for conservatives. And I wrote a piece at the Daily Caller earlier this week arguing that, Tim Pawlenty had a much smarter move, which was to, apologize, admit he was wrong about cap and trade. And regardless of how you feel about cap and trade, politically speaking, I think Pawlenty did the smart move in terms of winning a Republican primary. And Romney, I really feel like, is going to have, this thing weighing him down. And I don't think his speech does anything at all to help. It sort of confirms what everyone already knew that was paying attention. His primary distinction, is that individual mandates are fine, but they should be left at the state level. He did make one interesting point, sort of obliquely, which I actually agree with. I don't think it helps him, but he made the case that states are great laboratories for experiment like this, and I think that's true because if the federal government does something and it's bad, you can't leave as easily. I mean, you can leave, but if you live in Massachusetts and they do something that you don't like, that they raise taxes or whatever, it's easier to move to another state. And so ultimately, when you see states growing in population or losing population, growing in tax revenue, losing tax revenue, you can actually sort of say this state has better policy versus that state. Obviously, there's a lot of factors. But overall, I thought it sucked. What do you think?
So I think it showed that in the race, there are two things that have been pointed out as likely huge obstacles for Romney: his healthcare policy and the flip-flopper label. And he was sort of stuck in this position where, in order to get rid of one, you've got to feed the other.
That's a good point.
If he's gonna get rid of the flip-flopper label and say, "Look, I'm sticking it out for the long haul on my principles," then he's gotta stick with his healthcare plan. And if he wants to get rid of the healthcare plan, then he's feeding the flip-flopper label. So this speech was means that he has obviously chosen to try to get rid of the flip-flopper label and sees that as more damaging than the associations between his healthcare plan and the Obamacare plan. What I think is problematic is the speech was very largely on the defense, and on the defense on a topic that is definitely his weakness politically. And I know owning up to it is supposed to be part of his way of attacking this flip-flopper label, but how much are you benefiting versus how much are you losing? And I think, in his trying to sell his own healthcare positions, he was really sort of stuck in the attribute, sort of like if I'm going to sell you a product and I'm talking about, like, you should get this iPhone because it'll store X number of numbers and because it gets X amount of service. Like, that's not what makes you want to get an iPhone. You want to get an iPhone because it's going to enable you to do cool things and stuff. And I feel like the speech was very stuck in sort of selling the product for the little attributes rather than.
But he's not selling an iPhone. He's selling.
Well, yeah, and that's the other.
He's selling the Nokia from 5 years ago that everyone had. I mean.
Well, and I think that he was very focused on creating a contrast between himself and Obamacare. And in doing so, I don't know if the contrast created was stark enough. And one of the more positive quotes I saw on Twitter was not from a conservative, it was from Ezra Klein. The tweet that stuck out to me was, he said, quote, "The problem Romney can't overcome is the individual mandate is good policy, and he knows it." And then there was a quote from Josh
I think
Barrow.
he believes it. I think he definitely believes that it's good policy. In fact, there was one time where he said, a lot of political advisors and pundits are telling me I should drop this issue, but I can't because that would be lying. That I should say this issue was a bad idea and apologize, but I can't do it because that would be lying. So he clearly believes that it's good policy. But he reminds me of a guy who, he says something stupid and his girlfriend gets mad at him, and he keeps saying, "Let me just explain to you." And his explanations keep digging the hole deeper and deeper.
I didn't really mean that you were fat.
Right. That's, yeah.
That's actually good. I mean, I feel bad for him. There's another tweet from Josh Barrow where he says, "I feel for Romney. The outrage over the individual mandate is and has always been a combo of opportunistic and bizarre. I've especially," and then a second quote, "I've especially never have understood why it's okay for government to levy taxes and is outrageous to require some sort of purchase." And so this is what has struck me as sort of a missed opportunity for him, is if I was in his position, and if I was trying to argue that the individual mandate is in line with my brand of conservatism. First, you've got to define what your brand of conservatism is, and there are the definition of conservatism these days is getting the government out of things as much as possible. But that's so. If you look at the individual mandate, however, it's more of a personal responsibility vision for conservatism, where it says the two visions would be in society in the status quo, we provide health care to folks who show up at emergency rooms and need care, and if they can't pay for it and they've got a gunshot wound, we take care of them anyways because it's the right thing to do. And the vision of conservatism that says the government should get out sort of says then the government should, people's personal responsibility means that people should have to pay for that themselves, and if they can't pay, then they shouldn't get care. Or the Romney vision, which is everybody on the front end should have to have some way of having that taken care of because it's a matter of personal responsibility for the same reasons that, you have to have insurance to drive a car. If you want to be able to rely on our healthcare system, it is a matter of personal responsibility and a way to feed the free market. He's basically there because the definition of conservatism that is prominent today is not really in line with the individual mandate. He's not made, I don't think he's not remaking the conservative case for the individual mandate, the case that had the Heritage Foundation loving the mandate originally. It's not as though Romney came up with this and there were conservatives that hated it forever and ever. It has been a more recent, there have been some that have been consistent, but there have been a lot that have sort of changed their tune as the political winds have changed. And so, but I don't think he tried to bring up the free rider argument, and the bigger problem is that those are the same arguments that Democrats were making. Right. From the Philip Klein piece that he had been tweeting today, he'd been tweeting about a piece he'd written called The 5 Failed Romney Care Defenses, and one of them is all about how, the quote is, "The idea of the mandate being a response to the free rider problem and a matter of personal responsibility has been central to Democratic framing of the individual mandate. In fact, in the law itself, the mandate is called the individual responsibility requirement." But I don't think just because Democrats co-opted a conservative argument means the argument doesn't still pertain to a flavor of conservatism. It doesn't make it an instantly liberal argument just because Democrats saw that it was here's good and co-opted it.
Here's the thing, though. Okay, so just as we're talking, I'm going through and scanning to see some of the immediate response. And Rich Lowry just tweeted out a piece at National Review by Avik Roy. And just to give you a flavor, the title is Mitt Romney's Illogical, Terrible Healthcare Address. And my take on Romney's position is that if you are a a conservative intellectual or writer, having this position that Romney has may still be a bad idea, but it would at least, it might make you interesting. It would spark debate. But if you are a candidate in 2011 and you take this position, I don't care if it's right or wrong, good or bad, it is insane. This is a loser politically. He cannot win, and if this is front and center, his best hope is to either walk away from it or to just change the subject and hope that it's not a defining issue for the race. But by embracing it, it's just that dog won't hunt. And the fact that he thinks he can just keep, if I just explain it to people, the more I know, the less I like this.
When you're explaining, you're losing all too often in politics. Too. And so, I mean, his strength is on the economy. And it's not as though we're not in an economic, in a situation where that plays to those strengths. We have a high unemployment rate. It's sort of like, why play to your weaknesses, play to your strengths. And he did a few other things in the speech that were probably not big winners. He referred to Arnold Schwarzenegger as his buddy. He had some praise for France. And it was, for those who didn't have a chance to see it, it was given as a PowerPoint in a lecture hall. And there were the more, Jonah Goldberg from National Review not have a lot of praise for this, obviously, in his tweets. But one that had the most levity was Romney's fail-safe plan, replace Iowa's population entirely with middle managers from McKinsey Consulting. It did have a tone that sounded professorial, and that had worked for Obama, but is also seen as one of his biggest weaknesses. So,
right.
That doesn't necessarily create a big
Well, it also goes to
either.
This goes to a point I actually made this week. Hate to quit self-promoting my blog, but I wrote a piece this week about why I think Chris Christie is the best positioned in terms of his branding candidate of all the people Republicans could nominate, because he is simultaneously he has the gravitas and charisma to match Obama, and yet he's completely different, whereas Obama is professorial, Christie is blunt, whereas Obama is, thin, how Christie is. So Christie is like, he can match him, but he's the exact opposite. And I don't think that Republicans want to elect somebody who's like Obama, not just ideologically, but even stylistically, for what that's worth.
Yeah, but and I think the timing was, I don't know to what extent the Romney team knew that the Wall Street Journal op-ed was going to come out the same morning. That kind of blisters him on this, but it's just sort of all came together in one politically bad moment for him. And, I don't think, I think everything in politics can change overnight, so I don't think that this means that I certainly believe he still has the ability to be a strong contender for the nomination. I am not sure that his position on his Massachusetts healthcare bill will make him unelectable to everyone. In the same way that I think that perhaps Pawlenty's decision to come out in that debate and walk away from that position doesn't mean it's not going to be in ads. It doesn't mean that the position went away. It means that he's going to say he's disavowed it, but then he can get tagged with that flip-flopper label as well. So it's not I don't think it's the last we've heard of it, and walking away from a position and saying you've changed your mind certainly doesn't mean that people will stop talking about it. With Mitt Romney's D.O.A.
Yeah, but
perfect example of that.
There's such a thing as if you flip-flop on everything, then that label sticks. But I think abandonment is a very underappreciated political tactic. And I feel like pride and stubbornness forces people to hold on to baggage that number one, isn't helpful politically, and number two, they actually may not even believe in anymore. But sometimes out of a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, as I think Emerson said. So, and anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about both Doublemint twins. We just talked about Romney. Let's talk about Huntsman, who is making a lot of noise and running, presumably going to run for president. Obviously, former governor of Utah, former China ambassador to China. And why don't you set it up? What was your take on Erick Erickson? And I don't know if you saw my response. But
okay, well, to set things up for folks, the The initial sort of volley was fired by Erick Erickson at Red State, where he posted that, and for a variety of reasons, it is not likely that Jon Huntsman was going to be Erick Erickson's choice of candidate.
Right.
Huntsman is sort of known as a more moderate choice in the race, and the fact that he was appointed in the Obama administration has always led many to believe that conservatives would not be a huge fan of him as candidate. But so the post that went up this week at Red State was Erick Erickson basically saying that because Jon Huntsman was serving as an ambassador in the Obama administration overseas, acting as the face of the United States in China, serving a Democratic administration, and yet at the same time was contemplating thoughts of running against that president that he was serving, that is horrible for foreign policy, that it's disloyalty to your president
Right.
and your country. And that was sort of the main crux of it, that by
Right,
harboring
the quote
these
here.
ambitions all overseas, you are being disloyal.
He says this calls into question the loyalty not just to the President of the United States, but also his loyalty to his country over his own naked ambition.
Yes. And there were some media reports that then followed out of this narrative, I believe a day or two later, diving into what were the actual tensions that began to emerge between Huntsman and his team and the Obama administration and the State Department folks after his intentions became more clear and after he announced that he was resigning. Because when he announced he was resigning, he still stayed on for a period of time. It wasn't as though he quit and left and that was it.
Right.
About how the administration sort of began micromanaging him. You know, when he was going to give speeches, they really wanted to make sure that the speeches, I believe the word was, they were kosher before they were given. So, yes, Huntsman's ambitions did begin to complicate that relationship, but you had a post sort of refuting Erick Erickson's point.
Right. My argument was, first of all, that I think and I like Erick a lot. Most people who watch the show know that. But I think that he went too far in questioning his patriotism and loyalty to the country. Sort of like, accusing somebody of plotting to run for president sounds so bad, so criminal. Politicians are ambitious. I don't think, yet maybe you can make a case that this is disloyal to Obama. But I don't think it's disloyal to America. As far as we know, as far as all the press reports I could find, Huntsman served honorably as an ambassador and was served very ably as an ambassador. I didn't put this in the piece, but I don't see challenging somebody for political office as being like this ultimate insult or slap in the face. I mean, we live in a democracy. It's a free country, and it's a competition of ideas. And if somebody serves in my administration and then runs against me, I may not be happy about that, but I don't see that as like this incredible betrayal. I don't think it's beyond the pale to do. I think it's a competition, a free market of ideas, and bring it on.
And it's also not as though this was some big surprise, like that Huntsman had gone off to China and then magically popped back with the surprise that he might run for president. I mean, that was part of the buzz when he was first nominated, was that Obama it's sort of like sending your enemy off to, like, get them out of the way. Everybody's known that Huntsman's harbored these ambitions.
Agreed. I mean, look, Erick makes some good points. Huntsman is not the most conservative, and I think it'll hurt him. The fact that he worked for Obama and is now running against Obama, I think that will hurt him. I mean, I think voters who don't like Obama in the Republican primary, that's going to be a strike against him. He's going to have to explain that. But I think that calling him, disloyal to America, I don't. I'd have to see some proof, more evidence than Erick suggested or produced, that shows that he was, some way ineffective as an ambassador.
Mm-hmm. There was a story, I believe, that was originally surfaced by the Daily Caller, I think, if I'm attributing this correctly, now actually, if you go to jonhuntsman.com, it is not a website that has been reserved by...
Yeah, it was the love letter.
A campaign entity. It's a lot of pink hearts and the quote-unquote love letter, which it's just, in my opinion, I think it's way overblown as a story. I think it just shows that he's a courteous guy who writes thank you notes. It's a little effusive, but, that does not get me upset at all. But I think that... I guess looking at this as a pollster, I'm always looking at these sorts of situations as, okay, what who are the, if you look at voters as there's a group of people, a pie of people who are going to show up at the polls, what number are going to be moved from voting for you to not voting for you as a result of a piece of evidence? And to the extent that somebody would say, you know what, I like everything about Jon Huntsman, except I don't like that he wrote this letter to Obama, or I don't like that he was appointed by Obama. I think there are enough things that, for instance, Huntsman's more liberal stance on civil unions, I think there are bigger reasons why a voter who is going to be apprehensive about Huntsman because he served as an ambassador in the Obama administration, if you're going to be apprehensive about him about that, you probably got a lot of other things that, you have other bigger, more policy-related questions on. So I think it's not helpful to him, but I don't think that at the end of the day that calculus is that's going to be the decisive issue. I think the more decisive issue is going to be he has some more controversial statements about the stimulus, and was the stimulus large enough? I think it's going to be things like that are more problematic for him than the position than having served under an Obama administration. And also, which is the argument against him then? The love letter argument that he was too friendly with Obama, or the Erick Erickson argument that he's disloyal to Obama? Or you could say it's a combination of both, but they sound kind of opposite to me, and so which line of argument do you run with? And so I'm much more inclined to fall in your camp that believes that this is definitely not an indication of disloyalty, but it was a very sort of scorched earth post about it, and that's why this popped up. Because the other thing that's been happening is you've had a lot of Democrats have been showing a lot of love for Huntsman. And there's a post by Ala Pundit at Hot Air where his sort of key quote was that if conservatives were given a choice of facing Mark Warner or Bernie Sanders in a national election, I assume most would prefer to face the latter since, as a leftist, he'd have a tougher time capturing independents than a centrist like Warner would. It's simple recognition that elections tend to be won in the middle, provided that the nominee isn't so far to the center his or her base won't turn out in big numbers. Making the case that the reason why Democrats have been so enamored with Huntsman as of late is because they want to make it seem, they want to continue to make him as unelectable as possible to what they perceive as the Republican primary.
Well, and they've done that with Romney, same sort of tactic.
Yeah.
It's interesting how they've tried to game the Republican primary. I don't think you have to worry about Jon Huntsman being the nominee. I could be wrong. If he can pull this off, then he will be quite a formidable adversary, because it will mean that you have somebody who might appeal to the center and somebody who's one hell of a politician who managed to, despite working for Obama, like a month ago or whatever, managed to win the Republican nomination. So he would be quite formidable. I don't think he can do it, but I also don't think that means he's disloyal. So let's so you're talking about polling. I'm seeing here that Herman Cain. Herman Cain, the man that I've been talking about for a year now, is in second place in this Zogby poll. He came in first place according to that focus group on Hannity that Frank Luntz conducted after the debate. I guess first question, do you buy, I don't know the methodology behind Zogby. Do you buy that he's in second place?
Okay, so I hate to throw the huge bucket of cold water on the Herman Cain is doing awesome in public opinion movement, but both of the examples are incredibly flawed. So the first is the Zogby poll, and I will leave the words of Nate Silver to sort of stand in. So Nate Silver has done these pollster rankings, and they're controversial, but relatively rigorous in how he looks at a pollster's. It's called pollster introduced error. He basically takes a pollster's work and looks at how it actually matches up with real results and things like that, and figures out, okay, so how much of a pollster's own noodling in the data has created error. And that noodling comes from things like how do they word their questions, how do they structure their surveys, who are they sampling, things along those lines. So one thing to keep in mind about the Zogby research is it's online. It is it's based on an internet panel. So while I tend to be a little skittish about landline-only polls, for a Republican primary electorate of likely primary voters, landline's not terrible. Internet is far, far, far more challenging for targeting that kind of an audience, and there's no disclosure of what a likely Republican is in this poll. We just know it's 100 or 1,300 and some odd likely Republican voters, primary voters.
So
that's a
let me ask
really
you,
narrow audience to target.
right?
And in
all the stuff, all those points are really good points, and I would say that although Nate Silver is a liberal, he always strikes me to be pretty right on.
Yeah, and in his pollster rankings, the Zogby online polls came in dead last out of dozens and dozens and dozens of pollsters. So I hate bashing on another pollster, but so I will just point to the pollster rankings of. His tweet today was, Zogby claims 14% of GOPers have Cain as their first choice, when real surveys show only 24% of them even know who he is. If you run a poll showing Chris Christie and Herman Cain atop the GOP primary field, it's time to throw in the towel. He's not a man.
Well, I understand why Zogby would do online polling. For one thing, it's cheaper, right?
Yes, it is dramatically cheaper.
Polling. But one would assume that over time, if your methodology is flawed and your results are consistently flawed, that would harm you. That would hurt your bottom line as a businessman. So why would a pollster as widely known as Zogby, and I think he's a pretty big dem, but why would someone put their credibility on the line if they knew that you're poking obvious holes in this survey? Why would they do that, knowing that there could be repercussions?
Well, polling is right now actually in Phoenix. There is a conference going on, the APOR conference. It's the annual pollster get-together where everybody gets together and talks about how horrible it is that response rates are going down, and we talk about all the methodological things that are big challenges in our profession. And the toughest thing is that it's really difficult for the average sort of layman, and even for journalists who look at polling data all the time, to filter out what is quality and not quality data. And so if you're somebody who reads 538 religiously, then you know that Nate Silver does not have a very high opinion of this pollster. But if you're a corporation and you want to do a survey, you've maybe heard this pollster's name before, or that you have a connection to them, and they're able to offer you survey research at a low price. And online research is very cheap, and so survey research is really tough to quality control, because only in situations like elections do you have exact numbers that say, this is what your survey said, but here's what reality is. And so for a lot of things that corporations do, or that other clients want, it's really tough for them to know, are the numbers I'm getting from my pollster good or bad? And so I don't want to, there are plenty of pollsters who are great. There are some whose methodology I disagree with. So I'm mostly just pointing to the Nate Silver stuff on this one, because I'm really uncomfortable totally bashing on another pollster, but
let's
the
move
evidence
on
in
from
this
polling.
case is
So
that poll was not the greatest.
I actually, look, it makes sense to me that people don't know who Herman Cain is. But having said that, I predicted he would come out of the debate ahead, and I think he did win the debate.
Yes, and that's and among folks who saw the debate, it would not surprise me if he saw a great spike in his numbers. And I think the Frank Luntz focus group is less methodologically troubling to me than the results of that survey. I mean, I have a whole other bag of critique that I could that I would use for a focus group that is broadcast on national television as research versus as entertainment, and which one is it really?
My concern with the Luntz focus group is
I don't think
they're never undecided.
Did a good job in that debate, and that he would necessarily see an uptick in his poll numbers.
He's a great orator. He's an inspiring business leader, and I've been saying for months, if not a year, that he would probably, I don't think he's going to win the nomination, but I think he's going to be like the Mike Huckabee of this year, a guy who kind of comes from nowhere and makes a splash, maybe makes it into the top tier, and comes out of it kind of a political celebrity. And people kind of mocked me and laughed at that, but I think that they're going to see it happen. I was just on my podcast today. I just put it up. He is doubling down on the Afghanistan non-comment. You might remember they asked him about Afghanistan. He said, I'm not going to go into that because I don't know enough. I asked him about it. He's standing behind that decision, check out the podcast if you want to know why. But I think Cain is going to be for real. So we didn't talk about this earlier, but we might as well talk about it. Newt Gingrich. What? Any thoughts on him? I guess he announced via Twitter and YouTube, and I saw this morning on Morning Joe he was just being destroyed. I think Mike Barnacle had some very harsh words for him.
Yeah, he has a tough road ahead. Actually, now that you bring it up, there's a piece at National Review today by hold on, I'm pulling it up now that we're talking about it. I think that he definitely has a chance and this is a big if he is a policy-focused, disciplined candidate, because I really think this is going to be a campaign that's much more about policy than about personality. If this is a race of personality between Newt Gingrich and Barack Obama, Newt Gingrich loses 100% of the time. If this is a campaign of Newt Gingrich versus the Republican field, and it's about personality, Newt Gingrich has problems. But you make a very good point.
Let me just interject real quick. Conservatives are so, I believe in this Palin derangement syndrome. It exists. Well, there's also Obama derangement syndrome. And there are a lot of conservatives who can't stand Obama so much that they think that he turns everybody off, and they don't realize he actually is a somewhat appealing figure. They just hate him so much they're blinded to it. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I think the point you're making is right, and Newt is an ideas machine as well.
Yeah, and so in that sense, if Gingrich gets the nomination and there's a debate between Gingrich and Obama, oh my gosh, I would love to see that. But there are risks being if it's about personality. I don't know if that works as well in Newt's favor as if this race is all about policy. And I think, I mean, this is a broader discussion, but a lot of the research that I've shown really shows that America is a center-right country on economic issues in particular. And so given that my sense is that the economy remains the top issue and is going to continue to be a top issue so long as unemployment remains high, the housing market remains depressed, and we sort of stay on this path. If that's the case, and if Gingrich is able to run as the guy who can come up with the innovative ideas that are different from what you've been hearing from everybody else, who actually can fix the country, if he runs as that guy, I'm not writing it. I'm not writing him off because of the personal life stuff. But
I would say that if and every year is different, but in a vacuum, if you told me who's going to win, the guy with the best ideas or the guy that's more likable, I'll tell you that the guy that's more likable is going to win. So
I disagree. I think in a time when the economy is good, or in a time when direction of the country numbers and polls are showing that people generally think the country's in an okay state, then personality is what matters. But I think people elected Obama because I don't think Obama got elected because people liked his ideas and his policy positions. I think they elected him because he seemed like hope and change, and they liked him personality-wise. And I think a lot of independent voters in particular are not fans of that. There was a panel I was on about a year ago with, I think it was Dave Weigel and Ross Douthat at AEI, and we were talking about who could pull it off in 2012. And this is when they were all talking about how Mitch Daniels could be a good choice, because if there was ever a time in American history when the bean counter guy in the green visor could pull off a win against an extremely attractive and charismatic candidate, it was going to be a year like 2012. And so I think that ideas and policy are going to play a substantial role moving forward. And I think this could be one of Newt's strengths, but if he stays on secular socialism, or if he stays on these things that aren't core issues to most Americans, he's not playing to his own strengths.
Right, and that's interesting because that's been his bread and butter lately, and in the past couple of years. And it seems weird to me. Maybe the calculus is you have to do that to win the Republican primary, and then you move over. Let me say this, just going back to the last point. Was it P.T. Barnum said, you can never go broke underestimating the intelligence of the average person, or something like that. There's things that you always bet on. I always bet on charisma. I challenge you to tell me the last time that voters said, yeah, and by the way, this is an argument that people are making, that after the Hope and Change, Yes We Can, charismatic campaign of 2008, voters might be looking for someone more boring, that boring will actually be attractive. I can't think of a time in history when voters have actually said, Bill Clinton's too charismatic. I want a regular guy like Bob Dole. It just doesn't happen. Bet on charisma.
Well, no, I agree that you need a candidate who can fire people up and get them energized. But I think that somebody who's an empty suit isn't going to work, isn't going to fly this time. And so if you can get the best of both worlds, great. And there are a lot of speeches. If you watch, there's a great speech YouTube clip that I've sort of always kind of point people to when I want to make the case that Gingrich is able to give the sort of speech that can rile people up. He gave a speech in Detroit, I think, to a group of business leaders there, because he's always bashing on Detroit as like, look, this is what failure looks like. And he went there to give a speech about, okay, here's what I would do to fix your town. Here's what I would do to bring jobs back to Detroit. And it's actually a really compelling speech. I mean, he has a few oddball policy ideas.
Yeah. Well, and let me say, when I was talking about the charisma thing, I think Newt is charismatic. Specifically there, I'm talking about Mitch Daniels, because that's an argument people have made that Mitch Daniels could beat Obama because people would be sick of charisma. I do think Newt's charismatic, maybe not as likable as Obama, but definitely Newt is charismatic. And anybody who doesn't think so, go watch him at CPAC when he comes in through the back of the room. Instead of coming in through the backstage, he comes in through the front of the room, I guess.
It's like the end of the first season of Glee.
Yeah, the Eye of the Tiger's playing. That's his theme song. It's great. Well, hey,
I mean, and I think he gets the sense of, Newt also understands the sense of history, right? Like, he's a history professor. He gets the gravitas of the presidency and sort of the spectacle that is around it. So, I wouldn't write him off on the personality side completely, but I think his strength is on the issues side. And I think issues are going to play a bigger role in this campaign, unless the economy magically gets better. And
I feel like Newt, it's so funny. I feel like Newt, he has great ideas, but I feel like he has really gone out of his way to throw red meat the past few years.
Absolutely.
I just don't know that that's worked for him. I mean, some of it's good. Some of it I agree with. A lot of it I probably agree with, philosophically. But strategically, tactically, in terms of positioning him, I'm not sure I would have advised him to go that route. Any thoughts on that? Why is he doing this?
Well, I would not have advised him to go that route either. I mean, what I think he may have been hoping for is what did happen briefly with Donald Trump, where Trump came out and said a lot of sort of crazy, outlandish things.
Yeah.
And then a lot of really sort of scorched earth things about, the failures of the Obama administration, and went for the jugular. And I think, and you saw all of a sudden Trump popped up in these polls. Now, a lot of that was name ID, but Newt Gingrich also has plenty of name ID. And so I think he was hoping that, by saying these things and really sticking it to Obama, he could harness some of that energy and boost his numbers. And that could engender some good, some favorables where his favorables are lacking.
And you are rewarded for being extreme. I mean, Erick Erickson's piece, had it been the same piece, had he been critical of Jon Huntsman, but had he just not called him a disloyal American, he wouldn't have gotten the attention. I wouldn't have written about it. So there is a certain sort of incentive to use fiery rhetoric. But Erick's not running for president, right? And neither am I. And so, some of the tactics that you may use as a pundit, and let's face it, Newt's been a pundit, so maybe he's picked up some bad habits from his days, bloviating.
I do not advocate the Charlie Sheen approach to increasing one's name ID. And so, whatever the political equivalent of that is, there's a line when bomb throwing is not you creating a strong contrast between your ideas and your opponent's ideas, or what you would do for the country versus what your opponent would do for the country, and it just sort of becomes, I would really like more eyeballs on me, please. And that's something that you see usually done by folks who have very low name ID in a race and need to say something big and bold to get the spotlight on them. So it's odd for Newt Gingrich because he does not have low name ID. I mean, despite having not been elected to office in over a decade, he still retains, he's very visible. People still know him, and he has a platform on Fox News. So
I think I would have told Newt, I would have tried to sort of do this thing where you are solidly conservative on the issues, which he hasn't been, by the way. He hasn't been, because he did that ad with Nancy Pelosi. I would have said, be solidly conservative on the issues, but be respectable and credible to the point where, intellectually honest members of the mainstream media can say you're smart, can back you, or at least take you seriously. He really hasn't really done either. He's deviated from conservatism. He backed Didi Scozzafava in New York, which sort of undermines his conservative credibility. But then by throwing this right-wing rhetoric around, he's also alienated mainstream journalists, even those who might be intellectually honest, to the point where they can't in good conscience. So I don't know, it seems to me like a lot of short-term decisions for a guy really super smart, a lot of short-term decisions to get press versus a larger disciplined strategy of building a brand.
I could not agree with you more.
Let's move on then.
Okay.
Last topic, we wanted to talk about Obama, right?
So to wrap up on his speech on immigration, and the things that I've mostly been seeing out of bloggers on the right have been criticisms of the speech that it was purely political. You have Douglas Holtz-Eakin at National Review's Corner, where he says that if the border was genuinely secure and Obama felt confident it could be demonstrated, why not actually draft a reform bill, send it to Congress, make the case for reform on the merits, and lead the nation to immigration reform. You have Jim Angel at American Spectator saying, think of this as a get-out-the-vote effort. What Obama can do and seemingly intends to do is use the immigration issue as a political tool for painting Republicans as anti-Hispanic in advance of an election. And you have Katie Pavlich at Town Hall who points out that in a piece this week that the border is not safe. And I think that's something that if you ask folks in border states, like for President Obama to go down to Texas and say, the border's safe, you guys, why are Republicans asking for a moat with alligators? For folks who are living along the border where you are continuing to hear about, drug-related violence spilling over, I almost think it's kind of the equivalent of standing up and saying, like, oh, the economy is, recovery summer, if you will.
Right.
It sort of stuns me that he would give that kind of speech, and understanding that politically it's trying to position Republicans as anti-Hispanic, but I think that was sort of an oddball point for him to. I mean, he needs to tout and try to make it seem as though his administration has done great things, but I don't see that as having a lot of credibility among the folks who are most directly impacted in the border states.
Well, I think you're right. I think the alligator comment is one of the things I really don't like about Obama. So he kills Osama bin Laden, and I like that, and I gave him credit. I just kind of defended him. Then he goes to Texas and gives this speech, which was incredibly, politically motivated, trying to get Hispanic votes and trying to make, to make it look like if you want a secure border, you're a racist or something. And he gives this speech, and he talks about, he creates all these straw men, the alligator thing. I don't know. He uses these cheap rhetorical devices that I kind of think are beneath him. And when he does it, he loses me. He turns me off by that. Even every once in a while, and this used to happen where, he ordered the killing of a Somali pirate, and I gave him credit here on this show, in fact. And then I think, the next time he gives a speech, he comes out and he bashes Bush out of nowhere. So I don't know what it is. I just see these as cheap shots. And, I don't know if there's any numbers on this, but these sort of rhetorical devices, setting up straw men, is just beneath him, I think.
Well, I completely agree that it's beneath him. I don't know who he is persuading I think he's at his best when he is giving speeches that are more positive and more about. So he talks about the need for immigration reform. What does Obama's immigration reform look like? I mean, that's sort of the heart of that Davos Whole Deacon post that I referenced earlier. Is okay. So draft a reform bill. If you think the border is actually safe and you think it's safe enough to where we can now pursue comprehensive immigration reform, and that you've done what you need to do to satisfy the secure the border first crowd, then put your money where your mouth is and write a piece of legislation. Because I mean, isn't this what we saw in the healthcare bill, that there really wasn't leadership from the White House, that was part of the problem, that it was sort of an issue that he talked about, but then the legislation itself was left to Congress, and that's when things got hairy. Obama likes to give speeches, but I would, if he really wants to stand up for comprehensive immigration reform, okay, then put a bill together and see what those independent voters in swing states like Arizona have to say about it.
And by the way, Bush tried that. And John McCain tried that, and they got burned, but they tried it. And I resent the fact that if you want to secure the border, that the Democrats want Latinos to believe you're anti-Hispanic or a racist or something. Having said that, actually, another cheap self-promotional piece I wrote. A recent piece at the Daily Caller, which is 5 arguments for why conservatives should actually want more Hispanic immigration. It's not illegal immigration, and there are a lot of conservatives who do want more Hispanic immigration or more immigration, period, just not illegal. But there are some great arguments for why. And Arthur Brooks at the American Enterprise Institute made a really fascinating point. It's one of my 5 points. He says that immigration is one of the most entrepreneurial things you can do. If you think about it, the type of person who is willing to leave their country and their friends and whatever behind them and move to another country to try to forge a better life, that's a pretty good American. That's the kind of person who might take risks, might start a business, it's a very entrepreneurial move. And those of us who are blessed enough to be born here, we don't necessarily, come into the world or with that same sort of ambition. So there are a lot of, very good conservative arguments for immigration, and it's just a shame that it gets bogged down and politicized. And now there's this true perception that, more immigration equals more Democratic voters. So you have Democrats pushing for it for political purposes, and Republicans, despite policy arguments for why it actually might be good for the country, pushing against it for political purposes. So it's become such a politicized argument, and Obama is making it more political, I think.
The argument that you made and the Arthur Brooks argument about the entrepreneurial spirit, I could not agree with more. This is something that in every focus group I do, where I have folks of Hispanic or Latino descent who are Democrats or are independents, it never fails that in those focus groups, those are folks who are expressing, pride in starting a small business and things like that, and it always drives me up a wall. Why hasn't the Republican Party spoken to these?
Right.
They are such natural fits, in my opinion, for at least what I believe the Republican Party stands for or should stand for, and it drives me berserk. And I think what's interesting is that you have in Obama's speech, this was a point from the Katie Pavlich post, that the president, I'll just read her quote, the president did what was expected by lumping all immigrants together and failed to distinguish the difference between the two, that being legal and illegal. In fact, Obama went out of his way to make sure Americans believed there was no difference, as he referenced immigrants from different countries coming to America and seeing Lady Liberty. I think the big problem is that Republicans kind of do the same thing but the opposite. A lot of times rhetoric about immigration is really focused on curbing illegal immigration and why illegal immigration is bad, but we just talk about it as immigration. Mm-hmm. And so it turns into this whole I hate having to press one for English sort of thing.
Well, look, I have no doubt that some of the people, and by the way, one of my 5 arguments for why conservatives should favor more immigration is that the anti-immigration movement was started by a radical environmentalist who, I don't know if you saw that New York Times piece that we talked about.
No, I haven't seen.
This guy, he basically was worried about population growth and how it could impact the land. And so the first people he went to were like Planned Parenthood. He wanted to get them on the anti-immigration bandwagon, and they laughed at him. But so I have no doubt that some of the people who are worried about immigration, who are worried about illegal immigration, that some of them are in fact racists. I have no doubt that some of them are. But I also think that, look, any nation that cannot control its borders ceases to be a nation. You have to be able to control your borders. And I think that if we really could control them, then after you've demonstrated that you can control them, then I think you could come back and start talking about like the DREAM Act, right? That was something that got shot down recently. But the DREAM Act, as I recall, says like if you came here illegally, maybe your parents brought you here when you were a child. If you're in college, if you're in the military, look, one of the reasons that we're going to beat China is China has this ridiculous, one child per family law. And what that ultimately is going to mean is that there's going to be one young Chinese worker supporting 4 or 5 elderly Chinese. It's a demographic time bomb. And here in America, of course, we have a low birth rate, not that low, but we're being supplemented by having immigrants come in. And why would we certainly kick out a PhD immigrant? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So,
well, yeah, and it's issues like that where you've got on the one hand you've got like the H-1B visa issue that is very different from like the need to have something securing our border,
right.
But like it all sort of gets conflated to why are people coming here and taking our jobs, or why do I have to press 1 for English, and it becomes this bad argument. And it's not even necessarily. I don't think it's conservatives who are making those arguments, but it's how Democrats are characterizing,
right.
in many cases.
This is like it's like the Paul Ryan thing. It isn't. I mean, you and I are actually having an adult conversation about this topic, but it's really almost impossible to have an adult conversation about this topic. I mean, this is like as close as it gets, and this will probably come back to haunt us both. But you just can't have an adult conversation about it without it, being politicized, and that is unfortunate. It is what it is.
Well, and I think one of the things that struck me the most is there was a documentary that I caught a couple years ago all about, it was immigrants coming from Eastern Europe. My grandparents are of Slovak descent, and it was all about how these immigrants from, it wasn't Slovakia at the time, but, they were all coming over to like Pennsylvania and the Northeast, and a lot of the same arguments that you hear, the sort of cultural...
Oh, yeah.
The fear of, people should, why aren't people speaking my language, and, are people going to assimilate and stuff? And by and large, the Slovak population in the United States did assimilate, and I think there are justifiable concerns that America that assimilation is not an important enough priority nowadays, and that we ought to do things to help folks integrate as best as we can and do what we can to help everybody learn English, because it's a way to really advance yourself in America. There's a difference between making the argument for why we ought to help folks assimilate and integrate so that they can become a part of our nation and we can benefit from what they bring and we can supply,
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between that and the way a lot of conservative rhetoric either happens or is mischaracterized by things like President Obama's speech, when it is in fact Obama's speech that was lumping all immigrants together as one sort of thing, when there are some folks who play by the rules and do it right, and there
right.
are some folks who are not, and there should be a distinction between the two. And sometimes the right and the left do not do a good job distinguishing between the two.
I couldn't agree with you more. And maybe
well,
that's a
on
good
that
place.
note, I think we've... Well, now that we've had an adult conversation about the mandate and about immigration that will probably prohibit me from ever running for public office. Thank you very much. This has been good. So you can check out my stuff at KristenSoltis.com. I am participating on a show on Pajamas Media, PJTV. And Matt, you can find your stuff at
the Daily Caller. And,
all right.
Yeah,
Matt, it was great talking to you, and we'll see you sometime soon.
You got it. Thanks.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.